Well, friends and family and civil rights activists came together today to celebrate the life of Tyre Nichols. The 29-year-old died after a brutal beating by 5 officers in Memphis. The violent arrest was captured on security and police body cameras. Those officers are now facing murder charges, and 2 others are suspended. The CBC's Chris Reyes has more on the tributes for Nichols today and the calls for police reform.
At his funeral service at a church in Memphis, Tennessee, Tyre Nichols' casket was showered with song and scripture.
We have come into this place locked in solidarity across the nation and world to celebrate the life of Tyre Nichols, a good person, a beautiful soul.
Mr. and Mrs. Wells, he is your son. Now he is our son. And he is always God's son.
Thousands attended the service. Sitting in the front row, Nichols' family. His sister shared words of heartbreak.
I screamed at God, asking how could he let this happen?
Also at the service, the family of George Floyd, Eric Garner and Breonna Taylor, Black Americans who were killed by police. Vice President Kamala Harris sat beside Nichols' parents.
Mrs. Wells, Mr. Wells, you have been extraordinary in terms of your strength, your courage, and your grace.
Veteran civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy and very quickly into his speech spoke directly to the 5 officers who have been criminally charged with Nichols' death.
In the city that Dr. King lost his life, not far away from that balcony, you beat a brother to death.
This celebration of Nichols' life comes just days after Memphis police released a series of videos showing police brutally beating Nichols on January 5. He was pulled over and immediately shoved to the ground. He was tased and beaten by a baton. He died in hospital 3 days later. At the service, a call to action from Vice President Harris.
We demand that Congress pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Joe Biden will sign it.
The legislation includes sweeping reforms to address excessive use of force, racial profiling, and police misconduct. The service was filled with calls for justice, but also stories celebrating Nichols' life, his love for photography, skateboarding, sunsets. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
Well, let's bring in Reverend Andre E. Johnson, a reverend and community organizer in Memphis. He attended the funeral today. Reverend, thank you so much for taking time for me today. You had just attended the funeral, as we said, at the Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church for the funeral service. Describe for me the mood there.
Thank you thank you for having me, Natalie. And the mood there, as you can imagine, was solemn, was spirit-filled, but also joyous and happy because we celebrated the life of Tyre Nichols. And those pictures that you just showed that were flashing on the screens as the service was going on, was just a reminder of how vibrant a life that Tyre Nichols lived, and the legacy. And his legacy will live on through this service and through all of us working for and standing with the family.
A beautiful celebration of life, of course, the memory of him as well. At the funeral, we know there were also calls, though, for justice for the community. For you, what would that look like?
Oh, several things. Number one, we disbanded the Scorpion unit, and that's great, but disband all of those units. Let's reimagine what public safety would look like. That's what justice would mean. Let's sit down and begin to understand that more police officers concentrated in one particular area is never the answer. We have tried that time and time and time again. It is not the answer. We ought to know that by now. So let's come together to reimagine what public safety will look like. You know who wasn't safe that night with 5+ police officers around? Tyre Nichols wasn't safe that night. So we need to reimagine what public safety looks like for all of us in this community.
And as you reimagine that, how does it look for you? What would that actually look like?
It would look like engaging with the community, first and foremost, listening to the community. Then, secondly, and most importantly, believing the community when they tell you, because a lot of, there were several people before this tragic, horrific event that was telling people who would listen that these Scorpion units, these special units, policing here in the city of Memphis was not always a good experience. And now we see the result of all of that. So first and foremost, listening, believing the stories, and then working together to solve some of the baseline issues like poverty, education, job opportunities. Let's work together to do that. Let's reimagine what public safety looks like.
We know the action has been relatively swift taken against police officers involved in the death of Tyre Nichols. In your opinion, has anything changed in the 2.5 years since George Floyd's death?
Wow, we would like to think so. And maybe the swift firing of these officers and the swift indictments all happened within 20 days. Maybe, just maybe now, as Attorney Ben Crump has been saying, that Memphis can point the way of what can happen to hold officers accountable, to hold the system accountable. And maybe that's something that we can point toward. But really, we don't want to be back in this situation. So we ought to do everything in our power to make sure that we don't have another hashtag by the name of a Tyre Nichols or anyone else. We need to work together. We need to come together. We need to listen to one another, and especially the people that are going to be really affected by any actions that the city and elected officials would take.
What message would you like to send to people who weren't able to attend today's service?
Wow. Oh, that's a great question. Here's the message. The message is all about love. It's about spirit. It's about remembering. It's about legacy. It's about what Tyre Nichols left behind. As the Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher mentioned in the service today, he left behind a family. He left behind sisters, brothers, children. He left behind a legacy. And it's all about all of us, again, coming together and standing with the family, being with the family, being an embodied presence to remind the city and everybody that we would just not push this aside. We will not forget. We will be with Tyre Nichols' family through this entire ordeal. So when all the cameras go away and when everything somehow, however normal will look like to them after this, we want to still be there fighting for justice.
Reverend, thank you so much for your time tonight. Reverend Andre Johnson joining me from Memphis.
Thank you for having me.